Today, we'd like to talk about this concept of real estate as infrastructure. We hear a lot about this idea of infrastructure as an asset class, and meaning electrical grid and solar power and, irrigation and all these sort of infrastructure, roadways, bridges. But this is that idea that real estate, what we traditionally think of real estate, particularly multifamily and industrial, that it is infrastructure. And so I wanted to speak a little bit today about that.
Well, the two things we invest in, workforce plus housing. In other words, not newer product, but sort of 80s, 90s, 2000s apartments, and small bay, multi-tenant industrial. The argument we're messing with here, toying with, is that these are a public good. Almost like, a community can't live without water and sewer and roads, electricity. Like, try having a community without without housing and without, small industrial spaces. These, on the housing side, this is where people live in a community, and you don't have a community without people. And on the industrial side, these are like the capillaries, or the smallest part of the blood flow system. This is where the very last mile of commerce happens. This is where entrepreneurship happens. This is where, small businesses live. This is where plumbers and distribution and specialty manufacturers live. This is where jobs are. So there is a very strong argument to make that these are a quasi-utility of sorts, or at least they have significant utility characteristics. I'll pitch it to you, but the last idea is the way we buy along the I-5, the I-15, and the I-25. 30% of the U.S. population lives in the Western U.S. on those, more or less, those highways, totaling almost $2 trillion of real estate. And it is a grid. There is a network, a node, almost like the electrical grid for those two assets. They feed each other. They supply and demand riff off of those markets. Populations move and stay based on how those things are. And it's an interesting spot we live, but the secondary and tertiary markets that we invest in are largely not institutionalized. And there is a process going on, of which I think we're in an early stages, and we are a leader in, where this utility is being utilitized?
Being institutionalized, at least. I mean, there is a fair analogy there, because on two levels. Number one, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we never heard this term infrastructure, because it was being done by utility companies or public agencies. It was not a investable asset class. And today, through various structures, there are more and more ways to invest in those utilities, in those infrastructures. And in our markets, there is an analogy there, because most of the real estate in our markets has been privately held. So it hasn't really been institutionalized. And so there is this kind of process of these markets becoming more institutional. And the other analogy or parallel to infrastructure is that the asset types we're talking about are kind of needs-based assets.
Yeah.
When you cross a bridge, you don't think usually, what a nice bridge, or what was the quality of that bridge, or what was my experience with that bridge. You just think, I got across the water. I didn't, the bridge was there. And while our job is to create environments that transform people's lives, so our job is to create an environment that is positive, that is memorable, we're dealing in an asset type that is much more like a bridge, in the sense that it's there, it exists for a purpose, and it is a needs-based asset. Now, where we excel is through making sure that our needs-based asset is more desirable than another, but these are fundamentally not the asset types that are, what would you call it, discretionary.
I love that, what you're talking about with a bridge. There's a thought in infrastructure or utility it's a monopoly. There's only one irrigation district. There's only one electrical company. So that's totally different, because how would you build new canals? There's only so much for rail. That doesn't really apply to apartments or industrial. They can build it anywhere. Well, here's an interesting little thing, which is that in most of the markets we work, let's take apartments, for example, market rents in those apartments are $1,200 to $1,700 per month. Well, to build a new apartment costs about $300,000 these days. In some markets, $350,000. In primary markets, it could be $550,000 or $650,000 per unit. But the point is, if you're going to spend $300,000 per door to build apartments, you need to get about $2,300 in rent. And in most of the communities we invest in, they're affordable. They're constrained. They don't justify new construction. Rents are $1,550, $1,650. They're not $2,300. And the people that are living there are not used to paying $2,300, and their wages aren't usually aligned with $2,300. So in a sense, it is like, the power company in that you can't build more 90s apartments. 90s apartments they're bigger, they have balconies. They don't build them that way anymore, and they can't afford to build them that way anymore. And unless they can get those high rents, they can't build more apartments. So it's this stalemate. But in that way, the markets we serve are robust and durable, and there's not going to be much new supply to meet, the steadily growing, that 3% or so a year demand. I think an important idea here, and what we're getting to in talking about this as infrastructure, is that real estate is a durable good, more durable than people think. What's interesting is that millennials are hitting peak spending. Gen Z is just coming online. In the Western U.S., over the next 7 years, there's projected to be demand for 2 million more housing units. I mean, there's millions of unbuilt units. This also comes at the same time as secondary and tertiary markets are arguably becoming the new primary markets. Instead of people living in major metros with gridlock and high prices, and in the post-COVID era, there's more work from home. There's self-driving cars. The people listening to this podcast right now are communicating with us in a way, that they're still interacting with us from their cars probably, and they're about to get on a Zoom meeting and have a meeting with someone who's not even in their city. So at the same time as new money, millennials and Gen Zs are coming fully online, drivers for secondary and tertiary markets are coming online, and yet new supply isn't being built. This is forming up a more durable thesis for these secondary and tertiary markets, and the idea that housing and industrial these are buildings. Yeah. They last decades. They don't last, this isn't a momentary thing.
Yeah, and in many senses, these markets are invisible because people don't recognize that Grand Junction has existed for 200 years and 150 years, and these markets have not only reasons to exist, but they've been growing year over year, and there's a whole ecosystem there that's existing that is kind of off the radar of the typical institutional investor.
Maybe close with talking about how we own the grid.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally goes back to our thesis of really building along the I-5, the I-15, and the I-25 as really the main nodes in the Western U.S. where all of that commerce is. And fundamentally, we believe that utility or real estate is like a utility. And these are markets that are not broadly institutionalized. These are markets that are underappreciated. And yet there is a grid-like, infrastructure-like necessity for these markets to exist and for the real estate there to exist.
It's a lens. If you choose to see it as like just owning an apartment complex somewhere, great. If you choose to see it through the lens of the network, how all the nodes in the network reinforce themselves, for us, with each new building we buy, with each new market we're in, these are beacons of information. These are pieces of conviction on the ground. It's both. On the one hand, it strengthens our original data. This is like lived data. This isn't just from some service. This is our own authentic data, which is conviction. And on the other hand, with each deal we do, we get more deals offered. So our alpha is really 15%. We have our own lived data, which builds conviction, and then our own, authentic off-market deal set, and what we do is we marry up where we see conviction forming with additional deals. And in that, we create alpha.
Yeah.